I am joined by Chuck DeVore, the Vice President at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Sir, thank you so much for being here.
Great to be here, Virginia.
So I want to begin by asking you a little bit about your story.
Sure.
You moved to Texas from California.
I did.
Not too long ago. Why did you decide to come to Texas?
Well, it's a good story. That was about 10 years ago. There's a few reasons. And of course, when you move, it's usually a very deeply personal thing when someone moves. For me, I had a pretty decent political career in California. I was in the state assembly there. I represented almost 500,000 people for 6 years. I was termed out in 2010, ran for the U.S. Senate in 2010. A woman by the name of Carly Fiorina got in the primary, and she had a pretty decent-sized bank account, and so tough to compete against that. But prior to my being in the state assembly, I was in the aerospace industry for 13 years. And all the places that I used to work, they were all the major headquarters. In the time that I was in the legislature and was then trying to figure out, what am I going to do next, all the major headquarters left the state. And so all the places I used to work were now someplace else. And so if
many of them came to Texas.
Yes, they did, in fact. And so if I was going to do the same work that I did prior to my elected career, I would be living out of a suitcase. And so that was reason number one. Reason number two was I'm a conservative, happen to be a conservative Republican, and I was seeing the state drifting further and further to the left. And I thought, this isn't really looking good for someone with my philosophy. I'm beginning to be considered by, the majority of the state to be somewhat on the extreme, right? So, maybe this isn't going to work out. So maybe the political path is also closing down. And then the last thing was a really unexpected curveball. My two in-laws both began to suffer from dementia at the same time. They were off in New York. We had a kind of an emergency hospitalization crisis. My wife went back. She's the oldest of three. She went back and assessed the situation. And I told her when she was back there and we figured out what was going on, I said, look, your parents cannot take care of themselves right now. They're not taking their medicines on time. And if you come back, you're just going to go back there every couple of weeks. Why don't you just pack, as many suitcases as you can, bring them out to California, and we'll figure out what's going on with them medically. And so we did. And, 1 week turned into a month, turned into 6 months, turned into a year. And, my father-in-law took over my office in my house. My mother-in-law took over my youngest daughter's room. And so you have 6 people in a house not really made for 6 people. Plus you had stairs that these people in their 80s had to navigate. So you're just asking for a terrible accident going up and down the stairs. And the cost of housing is so expensive in Southern California that it just wasn't an option to find a big enough place to be able to properly take care of my in-laws and still have room for my daughters and my wife. And so at that point, my campaign communications manager, a native Texan, he spoke today during lunch, Josh Trevino. He went to work for the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and he calls me up one day and he says, you need to apply for this job that we have. And it's like, Josh, this isn't really, the job isn't, up my alley. He says, trust me, apply for it. And so I did. I didn't get the job. However, they hired me as a consultant to work on some research. Happy to do that. And the research really involved me doing a due diligence of Texas. And so I was looking at all the bad things people said about Texas and whether they were true or not. And they were not true, right? Looking at U.S. Census Bureau data and all kinds of, primary source data from the federal government about well-being and poverty and educational achievement and things like that. And so eventually I told my family, look, we're just going to move to Texas. The economy is far better than California's. This was in the middle of the Great Recession, 2011. And I said, I think that maybe the foundation will hire me, but if they don't, I'm sure I'll find another job. Yeah. And so we moved. And that was 10 years ago. And my father-in-law still lives with us. My mother-in-law passed away about 6 years ago. He's 96.
Wow.
And in fact, he landed at Normandy about a week after the invasion. And he was a Navy CB. And
that's wonderful.
So we're happy to take care of him. And we're able to do so in a far bigger house for far less money because it's Texas, and that freedom then allows people to really meet demand more readily than they do in California. So sorry for the long story, but that's kind of an origin story, right?
Yeah.
That's why I'm in Texas.
No, it's great to hear that background. Well, and I think you're not alone in that. You're not alone in the individual looking at your family circumstances and saying, I got to move somewhere where there are more opportunities, where housing is more affordable. A lot of Californians are doing that right now. Even, we've seen Joe Rogan has moved to Texas.
Yeah, I've written a few stories about that. Yeah, no,
Elon Musk,
right?
Yeah.
Although I don't think either one of them were concerned about housing affordability, but there were other reasons for the move.
But are you concerned, as more and more individuals do come from states like California, that we're going to see a shift towards left?
Yeah. So what's really interesting about that, and I hear that all the time, and the first thing you have to wonder is like, okay, so since generally speaking, conservatives have more children than do liberals, let's do the math, right? So you can't just like do that forever, because then the blue states would become red, right? It's not like the left is regenerating itself, right? So then, okay, then you look at the U.S. Census Bureau data, where every year around in September they publish their estimate of interstate migration from state to state. And generally speaking, Texas is always the #1 destination. Sometimes Florida is, but as far as net positive. So you have people leaving the state, people coming into the state. And California is usually the #1 loser, often up there with New York. Well, the #1 destination for former Californians is Texas. But the #1 destination for former Texans is California, right? It's just that on the net, we generally get 30 to 40,000 more people coming here from California than we lose. So is it a problem? Well, polling has suggested that it's not. So we have historic polling as well as polling we've done ourselves at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. There's a poll done 13 years ago by UT Austin and the Texas Tribune showing that California expats are 57% to 27% conservative versus liberal. There was a very fascinating CNN exit poll that you heard referenced by Josh Trevino today at the lunch between Beto O'Rourke and Senator Ted Cruz for the 2018 election. And what that poll found was that native Texans, about 60% of voters, preferred O'Rourke by +3. Now, Cruz won that race by a little more than 2 points. But the 40% of Texans who moved here, like, by the way, did Ted Cruz, because he wasn't born here, right? They preferred Cruz by +15. Wow. So if it wasn't for the transplants who moved to Texas, that poll suggested that O'Rourke would be a senator. We did our own polling. We did polling for Trump versus Clinton, and we found that people who moved to Texas were 5% more likely to have voted for Trump than natives. So it was, as I recall, it was like +5 points for Trump among the natives and plus, I think, 12 among the transplants. And then we just did a new poll that I wrote about a couple of days ago in the Federalist, where we actually drilled down and looked at individual states. Right? We polled something close to 3,000 voters so that we could get enough granularity to see some patterns at the state level. And what we found was the most conservative region that was sending people to Texas was the Rocky Mountain West, followed by the 4-state region of Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, and Mississippi. Number 3 was California. Wow. Yeah, exactly. Now, liberals were also coming in on balance, right? This is, not individuals, but populations of people. So the South Atlantic region from D.C. down to Florida was sending people that were more liberal than the natives. And, of course, foreign arrivals who are naturalized citizens were the same as the people from the East Coast, the Southeast. So that was a fascinating exercise, and I'm really glad that we had the chance to do it. It took, as I recall, 4 months worth of polling for us to come up with that. So it's not quite what people might think it is, right? People come here for their own very deeply personal reasons, and you can't assume that because someone came here from a blue state that they're going to have liberal views.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting and good news that, okay.
So far, right?
Yeah, so far.
Things change, right? Things always change. And in the city of Austin, you do probably have a more left-wing person move here on balance because, again, it's the tech industry and it has its own kind of culture. But frankly, Austin's always been Texas's most left-wing major city because it's a government town, right? You have a lot of government workers. You have UT Austin, so you have several tens of thousands of professors and other administrative personnel at UT. Well, that's not exactly a conservative bunch of people, right? And of course, the tech industry. So those three things together have pretty much, ensured that Austin is going to be probably left-leaning for the foreseeable future.
Yeah. Now, I know that the Texas Public Policy Foundation, you all are really on the forefront of making sure that Texas does stay Texas, that American values are promoted. Share with us just a little bit about how you're doing that and really what your mission is as an organization.
Right. So we've been around, I think since the late 80s. We have a little over 100 people at the foundation, mostly in Texas, but we have people who work on issues around the country. And we have an operation in D.C. called States Trust that's kind of like our embassy of common sense, of Texas common sense to the swamp in Washington, D.C. And that's a fun operation as well. So most of our work focuses on the Texas legislature. I testified numerous times this last session, mostly on election integrity matters, but other bills as well. Typically connected with research that I've done. I did a few research papers on threats to election, free and fair elections. So as part of that then, we're certainly helping the legislature better understand the issues and ways that they can kind of adapt Texas's laws to changing circumstances to try to optimize freedom and opportunity here in Texas, and as well increasingly on some of the cultural fronts. So, for example, we were engaging on the issue of critical race theory and promoting a bill that would explicitly prevent the teaching of critical race theory in our government classrooms. The funny thing was you saw some of the arguments from the left saying, keep the state out of the classroom, and it's like, excuse me, this is government education. Kind of, it is the state. The classroom is the state. So it was kind of funny to see people trying to push back with that as a slogan. I would say that we have a pretty integral role in how the Texas legislature kind of views some of these issues. We testify at hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of bills in a given session. And then starting next week, we go off around the state. And so I'll be traveling to places like Amarillo and Lubbock and Houston and Dallas and San Antonio, and we'll be speaking to individuals who show up and want to hear our take on the session. What is it that we accomplished? What is it that was left undone? Why we should be concerned about those things that were left undone, and how we can try to improve things in Texas. And so we'll be doing that for several weeks with, probably 10 cities, I think, on the stop. I can't even pay. I just go where my Outlook calendar tells me to go and
right.
Pack enough underwear to make sure that I can last for however long I'm going to be on the road.
Sure.
So no time to rest.
Absolutely not. Well, and one of the issues that everyone right now is talking about across the country, but especially right now in Texas, is election integrity. So not long ago, we saw, there was a push to pass election integrity legislation in the state of Texas. Democrats got up, they walked out of the session.
Yes, they did. Yeah, constitutionally, Texas requires a 2/3 of the members be present to constitute a quorum. So, with about an hour and a half left before the end of a deadline to get everything out of the House, they walked out, and not only temporarily killed the major election integrity omnibus, Senate Bill 7, but also killed a few other things that were going to be considered after that. And I think the main, first of all, we did see 7 individual pieces of legislation pass that are on their way to Governor Abbott's desk that incrementally improve the ability to have free and fair elections in Texas. And so those are already done. What we're missing with the with the omnibus, chief among the things we're missing is a provision for voter ID for mail-in ballots. So unlike in other states where mail-in ballots are a more significant portion of the vote, in Texas they have been gradually growing. They were about 1.8% of all the votes in 2010. In 2020 they were about 9% of the votes, so it's gone up about fivefold over the last 20 years. And the problem with that is that in Texas, for about the last 8 years or so, we require voter ID when you go vote in person. Government-issued ID has to be displayed, and if it's not, you can file a reasonable impediment declaration and I think vote provisionally. But with mail-in ballots, as it is in most states around the country, it's simply a signature verification, which is a very subjective exercise. And in Texas, it's typically done at the local level where you have a 2-to-1 board constituted by the majority of whoever controls that county. So it'll be 2 Democrats, 1 Republican, or 2 Republicans, 1 Democrat. And it's simply partisans deciding whether the signature matches or not. And so under current law, you could have a whole series of mail-in ballots that look suspicious, and maybe it's signed by the same person with the same ink, and the partisans might say, no, this is fine. There's nothing wrong with these signatures. Well, with a mail-in ballot ID, what we're asking for is inside of a privacy flap. When you request the ballot, you have to put in your driver's license number or your state ID number or the last 4 of your Social Security. And you also have to do that when you turn in the ballot, again, inside of a privacy flap. And what we're also doing is suggesting that information, if it's correct, really takes precedence over the signature, which is a more subjective issue. So it should strengthen the likelihood that voters will actually have their votes counted, even if the local political machine that may or may not be corrupt doesn't want to count that vote, right?
Yeah.
And so we think it's a common sense improvement to our election code. It's certainly similar to what was passed in Georgia and what, as I recall, was also passed in Florida, and frankly ought to be pretty common sense around the country.
Yeah. Well, and we've seen, though, with states like Georgia, with these pieces of election, the far left is just slapping a racist label on them.
Right.
How's that happening? Why are these bills being pegged as racist when election integrity is something we should all want, we should all be for?
Well, I think some of it goes, of course, to using incendiary rhetoric that the corporate media will parrot without thinking about it. I was on an MSNBC show talking about this where they were bringing up the specter of Jim Crow and all this. Of course, never mentioning it was the Democrats that did that. And they brought up this terrible incident of vote suppression that happened in Texas 61 years ago. So 3 years before I was born, and acting as if this was still like something that was pervasive and happened all the time. And I'm thinking, you realize that you just cited as your most pressing example of why these sorts of things can't be trusted in Texas something that happened in 1960, right? It's like, really? Wow, okay. That's a little stale. I mean, I don't know, maybe it's just me. But something that happened before I was born, and was done by the other party, right? By the Democrats in this case, the very people who are complaining about. So it's like, okay, whatever. Yeah. That was a little on the crazy side. So then the other thing they did in Texas was there's language that you find very common in the English, the Anglosphere, in the talking about things like the equal application of law, or of juries that are able to come to a decision independently and objectively, or of the ballot box. And the phrase used the word purity, right? Purity of the ballot box. It's actually part of election code in Texas, I think even part of the Constitution. And the preamble to the omnibus did have that language. And the Democrats, during the floor debate, when it was first considered in the House, claimed that this was a racist term that really was referring to wanting racial purity in the ballots, and they were claiming that this was the case and it was all part of Jim Crow. And, I thought about it. It's like, well, okay, maybe there was a couple instances where that was used during that era, just like in the antebellum South, the Bible was often used to justify slavery because there are references to slavery in the Bible, right? Now, I'd argue that the abolitionist case for abolishing slavery, also using the Bible, probably had a stronger theological claim. But the interesting thing, though, is that the Democrats' arguments about this phrase completely miss the fact that this phrase, purity of the ballot, occurs frequently in U.S. history going back to the 1830s, and definitely did not refer in any way, shape, or form to anything even remotely having to do with voter suppression, but rather had to do with concerns over vote fraud. In fact, the phrase was used in connection with constant abuses of free and fair elections by Tammany Hall in New York City, so much so that they actually invented at the time, this is something I didn't know, a glass ballot box, right? And they invented the glass ballot box so you could see ahead of time if it was stuffed, right? You just had to look at it, and it's like, oh, look, there's no ballots pre-stuffed. I guess we're good to go, right? And so I even found contemporaneous with that, with the landmark amendments that really launched the equal rights for all in America, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments after the Civil War. And so I found a Harper's Weekly magazine cover from that era, probably around 1867, where you saw a recently, presumably, because it was it was like a illustration, right? You saw like a recently freed slave, and then behind him was a black member of the Union Army, right? And they were going to vote with one of these glass ballot boxes that were made specifically to ensure the purity of the ballot. So it was the exact opposite, right? Not only was it just not so, it was 180 degrees opposite of what the Democrats were claiming on the floor, right? So here you have the purity of the ballot thought of as a good thing, right? And the illustration showing black men voting for the first time, right? Yeah. So anyway, it's just so amazing. And the problem, of course, is that when this is, when you're ambushed with this, and this wasn't on your mind to begin with, in other words, putting myself in the Republican shoes, why would they even think that this would have come up if that wasn't on their mind to begin with, right? That they somehow put in the language because they were racist, right? Because, oh, well, yes, we're going to put this in because really we only want certain people to vote, right? Yeah. And wink, wink, nod, nod. And they were caught flat-footed, of course, because that wasn't on their mind. And by the way, it was just part of Texas code, right? It was part of the Texas the Constitution. And again, the phrase having predated its use in the Texas Constitution by at least 40 years. So anyway, It's just a crazy example of how, these things are used, and then, of course, are picked up by the press and repeated ad nauseum.
So where does this bill stand right now? I know Texas Governor Greg Abbott says he's going to call a special session.
Yes.
Do you anticipate that that's going to happen?
I do. I think that probably we'll see it sometime after the 4th of July weekend by Independence Day. And the interesting thing politically, speaking as a former lawmaker, I think the Democrats in Texas are on really thin ice here, and for a couple of reasons. Number one, the issue of voter ID with mail-in ballots is approved by 81% of Texas voters, and that's with the same polling firm that we hired that Governor Abbott uses, right? I mean, these guys are very well regarded in the state of Texas, WPI or WPA Intelligence. That's number one. So you have majorities of even Democrats who support having mail-in ballots, having some of the same safeguards that voting in person does. That's number one. Number two, when they walked out, they also killed a very crucial bail reform bill. Now, because of court rulings, the existing bail system in the state of Texas has some very significant weaknesses that if you are let's say, a violent felon who gets arrested on a new violent charge, maybe you're accused of shooting somebody or stabbing somebody, but you have money, you can make bail, And what happened about a year or two ago is that exact thing happened out in Houston, and then the person who made bail went out and killed a police officer. Well, we haven't fixed that. And specifically, it hasn't been fixed because Democrats walked out on their job. And so what I think is very dangerous for them politically is that between now and the special session, until they actually come back and don't walk out, if there are any incidents that happen where you have a convicted felon or somebody with a known violent record but has the money to make bail because we didn't introduce risk assessments into the process and kill somebody, heaven forbid, that's on the Democrats. They had a chance to fix it and they walked off their jobs. And so I'm not sure that their leadership is going to want to keep this charade up much longer, because every month that goes by where they don't fix that is another month where they could see some very powerful hit pieces hit them in the mail come campaign time.
Yeah. Well, Chuck, we thank you for the work that you're doing at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Virginia.